Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest, or in today's case, two guests, take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that could just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement planning, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Now we're joined by, as I mentioned, two guests today. First is Alma Soongi Beck. Alma is counsel in Lothrop GPM's Private Client Services Group, and she has experience advising and presenting on the land back movement for title holders, tribes, and indigenous nonprofit organizations. And second, we have Professor Carillo. Professor Carillo is a professor of law and faculty director of the Indigenous Law Center at UC Law San Francisco. And for over 3 decades, she has taught and written extensively in property and property-related subjects, including federal Indian law. Thank you for joining us, Alma and Joe.
Thanks for inviting us, Dave.
Thank you.
So our celebrity subject today is perhaps the greatest athlete in American history, Jim Thorpe. A member of the Sac and Fox Nation. Thorpe was the first Native American to win a gold medal for the United States in the Olympics. He won the decathlon and the classic pentathlon in the 1912 Summer Games. And he also casually dominated in college and professional football, baseball, and basketball. So sort of a Native American Bo Jackson 70 years before Bo Jackson existed. He died of a heart attack, sadly, in 1953. And out of anger that the state of Oklahoma wouldn't erect a memorial in his honor, his estranged third wife, Patricia, actually interrupted his in-progress funeral in Shawnee and spirited away his remains to have them buried in a town in Pennsylvania that has since been renamed Jim Thorpe, although he never actually stepped foot there when he was alive. He did go to college in Pennsylvania, but about 100 miles away. The story gets even wilder, however, as it turns out that Patricia, after being rebuffed in her overtures to the Oklahoma government, had heard that at the time, Two-Borough Mauch-Chunk and East Mauch-Chunk were looking to increase tourism. That was the names of what was Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania beforehand. So she cut a deal with them to have Thorpe buried there. The two municipalities then merged, renamed themselves Jim Thorpe, and erected a monument in his honor, featuring his tomb, which is an above-ground mausoleum, and several statues, which created an instant tourist attraction. Since 2010, Thorpe's sons have been attempted to have his remains relocated to his native Oklahoma under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which was passed to allow Native Americans to recover remains plundered by museums, universities, and government agents. A federal district court ruled in favor of the sons in 2013, finding that the above-ground mausoleum containing Thorpe's remains amounted to a museum under the law. This ruling was then reversed by the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in 2014. This court relied heavily on the fact that Patricia was Thorpe's next of kin at the time of his death and had the legal right to determine his final resting place. It decried the application of the act to this case as patently absurd. Thorpe's sons and the Sac and Fox Nation contend that the Third Circuit improperly narrowed the scope of the act in a manner that would create a big loophole, which would then be used to effectively ignore the repatriation process. That's kind of the whole point of the act in the first place. This argument is further bolstered by the fact that the jurisdiction of the Third Circuit didn't include a single federally recognized Native American tribe, so they have less than zero experience in this area and probably shouldn't have been ruling in it. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court denied this appeal in 2015. As with anything involving indigenous people in this country, questions of property transfer, whether during life or at death, are exceedingly complex and fraught with pitfalls for the unwary. Alma, do you mind explaining to us and our listeners, sort of who may not know, what exactly the land back movement is?
Sure, happy to, Dave. The definition that I like to use in presentations to professional advisors is this one, which is a compilation definition I pulled from various sources. Land back is an Indigenous-led movement that involves, for non-Indigenous people, knowing whose lands we are on, educating ourselves and others, and in the case of estate planners, financial advisors, and tax advisors, assisting our clients in taking action to return land to Indigenous tribes and tribal organizations in a way that strengthens Indigenous sovereignty and communities.
So, Professor Carillo, if you don't mind, what are some of the more common traps that inexperienced practitioners may fall into when dealing with transfers involving Indigenous peoples or organizations of this type?
Alma and I have been working on this problem, and I've been looking at transfers globally and looking for paradigm problems. So one problem that I see right up front is that people think this is going to be a very straightforward issue. And there are many, many traps, as you mentioned, and there are lots of potential problems, because if we look at the broadest issues, control and the desire to control is really can lead to issues, as well as it can clash with this other desire, which is kind of the desire to control to the point of micromanagement. People want to be assisting tribal nonprofit organizations, but we're really in a property world where control is something we don't question very openly, very often. And so Alma's done some work on this, just the importance of, if you're going to make a gift, transfer, go ahead and make a transfer. Try to minimize the control.
Interesting. Alma, do you mind sort of expanding on that?
Sure.
Maybe with a more concrete example here of what someone, I guess, I can't picture what if they're trying to make a gift and then maintain control of the land.
Well, in the estate planning world, a lot of us have seen how a lot of clients want to maintain control long after they're dead. And this is where we get to how much of that makes sense and how much doesn't make sense. And that's not even including the land back issue. And so the common example you'll see is a client who owns a family cabin, and then they want their 5 kids and their 12 grandkids to co-own it together after they're passed. And even with only 2 kids, I've often seen that not go very well. And so I think the impression, I think it just gets to kind of this place in which some of our clients get very attached to our property, and we get very attached to our assets in a way where we're trying to control. Sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And it is really ultimately up to the client. So when we start talking about land back and return of land to Indigenous tribes, what we're seeing is that there's actually a huge increased awareness, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, and interest in actually returning land to Indigenous tribes and tribal nonprofits. As it turns out, a lot of these land returns are actually being done to the nonprofit organizations of both federally recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes. And then we start getting into the question of some people who actually are holding title to the land, they really want to do it with a conservation easement. And conservation easement is sometimes compatible with tribal cultural practices, and sometimes it isn't. It's a different thing that's based on a different origin. And so if you put an easement on a land, it runs with the land in perpetuity. And so it might be exactly what the tribe or tribal group wants or needs, but it might actually get in their way. And so that's an example of just kind of how there might already be an easement or an interest in putting an easement on. But the other thing that we're seeing also is that there is, in California, we're both practitioners in California, there's a bunch of state money that's available. And when you start getting into state money, it's great that there's state money available, actually, for tribes and tribal nonprofits to apply for, to do land return purchases. But it also, it's state funds, so it's hard to apply for. And then it often comes with restrictions. And so those are other kinds of restrictions that we see can sometimes make it more complicated for tribes.
I see. So when you encounter, typically, and obviously this will be apocryphal, I guess, but do you find it more it's during life transfers of people, or more at death transfers of this sort? People looking, they're looking to make this kind of move.
Well, I mean, so far in the context of my practice, we've done it only as testamentary at death
I
transfers.
see.
But it's only a matter of time where the
Yeah.
during life transfer is going to come in the door because, as estate planners, as you know, Dave, we're the key people that talk to people about their charitable giving and their charitable planning. And in some cases, it makes sense to do it as a current lifetime inter vivos charitable trust or charitable transfer.
I see. Professor Carillo, a lot of, I don't want to, I guess it's good to bring it up now just because we did just have the election, but it's likely that a lot of these things are going to get extended. I know that previously, sort of tax write-offs and stuff were sort of a large incentive to making sort of large charitable bequests like this, and a lot of that got cut up with the under the Trump administration, and a lot of that I think we're waiting for it to sunset, but now it is unlikely to. How is that sort of affecting people's willingness to, I guess, to sort of try to make these transfers?
Well, tax benefits have certainly motivated people. I don't know how it's going to change.
Mhm.
It will change, and I'm not sure how it's going to change. But I want to go back, if we can, to some examples about what we're actually dealing with, what I think we're dealing with when I'm looking at the conveyances that I study. There's land and there's money.
Mhm.
There are market transfers and there are testamentary transfers. And there are market transfers that occur. It'll be in the form of a landowner being willing to transfer property in exchange for whatever the price is, $4.6 million, $1.4 million. It's usually, market price. And a nonprofit organization can fund that purchase with public state funds. And that's where the restrictions come in. What the public is seeing, and this is a cautionary point, is that the public sees the websites of the land trusts or the media sources, and these are all very glowing. But when you look at the actual transfer documents, that's how to narrate the transfer. That's where the work is for the lawyer, I believe. And so when we look at testamentary transfers, we have a lot of experience in this country with the distinction between land versus money. We have a number of very famous trust cases where people put money into trust with the idea of just accumulating the trust funds. And I could talk about some of those. And the language in the trust document was very vague. And each one of the trusts was challenged at some point. So there will be challenges in the future. I don't know what's motivating people now, but I think one thing they should keep in mind is, the likelihood of a challenge in 5, 10, 15 years.
I think I would add here is the land back work is coming in the door in our practice, partly motivated by getting charitable deductions. And what you were referring to is the very high estate and gift tax charitable deduction that this year is 13.61 million, and next year will be 13.99 million. And so sometimes that's what motivates, but more of the time it's because they have heard about land back. They're already potentially charitably inclined. They might be connected with the work of a particular Indigenous tribe or tribal organization. Maybe they're involved in conservation or climate or environmental protection. Maybe they're very interested in ecological preservation and they know of the work that the tribes are doing. For example, in California, the traditional tribal practice of cultural burning is now Indigenous tribal groups are actually collaborating with CAL FIRE to figure out how to control the next big wildfire that we're probably going to have. And, if you go into the history of wildfires, in California, it was actually illegal for Indigenous people to actually practice their cultural practices, which included some of these things like cultural burning that actually protected ecosystems. And then, so even government agencies are coming around and realizing, that they actually need to bring some of these practices back. And so people are coming in with an awareness of that. That's what I'm seeing. Like I've been practicing for over 22 years in estates and trusts, and really all these conversations I've been having have been only in the last 5 years. I mean, I have clients coming in who actually, before they even knew I did any land back work or talked on the topic, would say, we want to give our house or our condo back to the local Indigenous tribe. And sometimes they would know who the tribe was, and sometimes they wouldn't. And actually, in a lot of the cases, getting back to your first question about where it gets complicated, is in many cases, there's more than one tribe or tribal
Mhm.
group that could potentially be a recipient. So that brings its own level of challenges. But there is a rising awareness. So like regardless of where the tax law goes around the gift and estate and GST tax, there is going to be, I expect, another like exponential increase in the next 5 or 10 years, regardless of who's in the White House and who's in Congress.
Mhm.
Because the cat's out of the bag. People are interested. They're realizing that it's important, and it's very connected to healing and community. It's really connected to climate justice, ecological preservation. Different political parties might use different terminology for whatever it is they're trying to protect, protecting of communities, protecting of families, but it's part of people's consciousness.
Interesting. I'm going to come back to that question of ownership, because that was initially going to be the next question, but now that you sort of brought up this trend that you're seeing and that you're anticipating continuing, do you have any thoughts as to why that it's what's happened in the last few years? I mean, that have really,
Yeah,
really
Dave,
produced this?
I think well, in 2011, the governors of California started with a series of executive orders that were working toward something of an apology to the
Mhm.
indigenous people of California. We've also started getting very serious about 30 by 30 implementation, the state's part in that. And so indigenous people are coming into 30 by 30. That's the goal to protect 30% of the Earth's land and
Mhm.
ocean areas by 2030. There's been a lot of agency and legislative action. And as Alma has mentioned, there have been over $100 million appropriated for various projects. And there's a very, I think, robust, engaged philanthropic community here too. So in addition to the wildfire situation, in addition to the environmental issues, this topic is very much alive in California.
Mhm.
It's being discussed both by the federally recognized tribes and the unrecognized tribes through that. And, it's really quite I would agree with Alma. It's coming a lot more because of an interest in conservation and engaged philanthropy. But I do believe that, of course, the tax law plays a role as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned so much of it has been testamentary, because, and this is again just sort of anecdotal, but the idea that hearts and minds have sort of been won over by recent actions. A lot of times I've found, at least in my work, that that sort of philanthropy of, oh, I've just discovered this and I want to give, that's kind of a young person's game.
Mhm.
Where a lot of times maybe people who sort of are more in the older and more in the market to make testamentary transfers, for charity, have sort of already decided, on a cause that they've sort of devoted their life to, and that's changes in the last couple of years wouldn't necessarily really motivate them as much. Do you think there's anything, I guess, unique about this? Like, it just seems like a unique confluence of factors to me, where a movement that seems largely driven by testamentary transfer is something that has actually been increasing because of recent changes.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a both and, Dave. I
Mhm.
think about in the conversations I have with clients, if they look already charitably inclined, but they haven't thought about the local indigenous tribe, but they have title to property because they have a house, I'll just raise it. I'll say, have you thought about giving your house to the local indigenous tribe?
Mhm.
And, half the time they're like, wow, I never thought of that. What a great idea. And half the time they're like, oh, maybe, maybe not, but the seed is planted in their mind. And part of why is that this particular thing, Joe's mentioned how it's also about funds because
Yes.
tribes and tribal groups need funds, but it's really about our connection to land. So even if we don't have title to the place where we live, we do live somewhere. And it is about our relationship to that place. And then if we work someplace, our office is based someplace, whether we
Mhm.
own that office space or not. And we grew up someplace and our school was someplace. So it's kind of it's part of the consciousness. I know that in a lot of nonprofit organizations and universities, there is a regular citing of a land acknowledgement where that they're acknowledging who the local people are and whose lands that they're on. And so that's why part of the definition of what is land back, part of it is being aware of whose lands we're on, and then thinking about what is the opportunity to return land.
Mhm.
I had a climate activist, I did a talk for one of our climate groups, and he said, what do I do about the fact that I bought my property with actual money, even though the person that they bought it from and that they bought it from and that they bought it from stole it or were part of the kind of taking of the land, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that's a really good point. And so if there's an opportunity, do your kids really need the house? I mean, if you have like $50 million or $10 million and you have a house that's worth 1 or 2 million, like, you know, but this is the question that we ask as estate planners anyway, is really
Yes.
like, who gets what? How much do they really need? Is it going to help your kids to get $100 million or is it going to hurt them? So maybe they should get 10. I don't know. These are the questions that everyone gets to grapple with. But really the starting place is, do you want to give the land that you have, that you hold title to, back to the indigenous tribe, and people can think about it. And maybe they need to build the relationship with that tribe or tribal groups. You know, especially when if there's 2 or 3 or 4 different tribal groups that it could potentially go back to, just like with any charitable giving, there's, you know, a number of different groups that might work on a particular cause at a particular area. So you want to get to know them so that you feel right about what the gift is. And then maybe it actually leads to a current transfer. So I think they're interactive in the same way that other charitable giving's interactive. And then I just want to say one thing about land back purchases, because you know, part of why it's in the public consciousness more is because there's a bunch of news that because there's been a very public fundraising campaigns where a parcel of land has become available by a private title holder, and they make it available to the tribe to purchase, but the tribe or tribal group has to raise like $2 million, $14 million, $24 million. You know, there's actually a $22 million fundraise that had to be done in Berkeley. And that group was lucky. That was the Segorite Land Trust, which is an East Bay urban indigenous women's group based in the East Bay. And they've been doing a bunch of land back work and also ecological and cultural restoration work. So they were well known. And so when they applied for funding to foundations, they were actually able to get foundation funding as well as private funding. So if you started to think about it in your estate plan for the testamentary gift, and then you get the news, oh, that same group is trying to do a fundraise because here's their great opportunity for a parcel that's very culturally important to them, then I think that's why they were able to do the fundraising.
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to me, I guess, that even if I were, in this case, if I'm looking, you know, if I have a parcel of land that I'm looking to give back, even if I were to sell it back to the tribe at market value, that would still be considered charity? Like that would still be considered a charitable bequest? Or
well, it depends on how they pay for it. For example, if they use state funds,
I see.
This is going to result in restrictions being put on the land, including a conservation easement, and there'll be a question of whether this is a charitable purpose. And so, at least in California, I mean, it could be that the Attorney General will be brought in. So when there's so many unanswered questions. Alma was talking about the local indigenous groups in an area. There can be more than one. There can be more than 2. And so, for example, with the conservation easement that was on one market purchase, and it was pretty much tracked to the California Civil Code, one of the first restrictions was that there was to be protection of Native American cultural resources. But protection was not defined. Native American cultural resources is not a term that's defined. Providing public access is not defined or limited. And so there are a number of terms just in the property codes that are so broad and not defined or limited for this context. That's why I think there'll have to be a little bit more definition going forward.
Interesting.
To your specific question about your house, for instance, you know, this is the question that comes like for my estate planning clients. They'll say, does the tribe want my house that's in a neighborhood somewhere in this county or in this town, right? So you're selling it to a tribe for fair market value is not likely really I mean, it's definitely not charitable. It's a market rate transfer. It would be a land return purchase if it was the parcel they've had their eye on that is like right on top of the most sacred piece of their land. So the ones that have hit the news are the land return purchases on these very important parcels that these tribes that were, you know, where their homes were located, where their ancestors are buried, where, you know, like that. And so they come up in slightly different contexts. It's just, those are the ones that hit the news because those are the big ones and they're doing fundraising. They're doing public fundraising as part of it. It's an interesting question though, like, my house? Does the local tribe want my house? It's like in a neighborhood, you know, it's like that. And part of that is also about this gets back to the first thing Joe was talking about regarding control, which is let them figure it out. They might want to use my house because housing in the San Francisco Bay Area is extremely expensive. And a lot of local Indigenous people can't actually live here because it's too expensive, right? So maybe they use it for nonprofit purposes. Maybe they have a nonprofit set up with church status where they actually part of what they're doing is providing affordable housing for tribal members. Or maybe they sell it so they can fund the land return purchase that they have their eye on in the other, right, exactly. So
you can also imagine a situation where someone wants to put money into trust and somehow provide, like Ben Franklin had this kind of trust where there was money in trust and he would lend out seed money for startups. But what was really key about his trust, which I think lasted quite a long time, is that those loans had to be paid back within a very particular period of time at a very set interest rate. And then, but other instances where people have tried to do that, for example, here's money, I'm putting it into trust, and I want the trustee just to allow the trust funds to grow so that loans or distributions could be made to help, quote, this is from the 19th century, farmers of industrious and sober habits, end quote. Those trusts have been they've been terminated. They never came into existence because they've been actually criticized as being no more than lending schemes. So there's a lot, I think, that might happen also with funds if people don't want to just give land, or if a tribe doesn't want to accept the land, but would rather have some sort of funding for the purpose of supporting the land they already have.
Is this the sort of thing where a practitioner might want to self-report and just like get a statute running, just to hope if they're just coming up with something, and say like, you know what, just like while you're filing it, just report yourself and just hope that whatever the 6 years or whatever just runs out before anyone cares.
Well, Alma's been working with a few terms, trust potential, just sort of thinking like how to articulate sort of where the land should go. I'm looking for one of her.
Right. Yeah. Are you thinking about just kind of like when we're not sure what tribal group it should go to? In that case,
this is very interesting to me also, like this idea that like, I guess for lack of a better term, the provenance, right, of the land, and trying to like figure that out. Like it's something that we're obviously much more used, especially with that term in like the art world. But even more complicated when things are stolen or bartered for worthless objects, often, unfortunately, in the case of this country. So how do you even start that process of like, if I am just completely, like, imagine that I'm completely ignorant as to this. I know that's a big stretch. And I walk in and say, hey, like I look to do this, and what would even be the first step of finding out who the land my house is on would even belong to?
Well, before Alma has a website, and before she talks about it, I want to say this, that because at the law school where I'm a professor, we ended up changing our name, and we've been very involved in the local Indigenous community. And what's clear to me is that sometimes, it is a provenance question. Like there is disagreement as to who has, or there can be disagreement as to who has the better claim to a particular area, a better ancestral claim. And that's really nothing I can answer or even get fully involved in. In my view, I think the Indigenous people work that out and let me know at the law school. But it is not the case that all of the ancestral land, for lack of a better word, claims are clear. They're really emerging, and there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of sometimes vigorous conversation about it.
I'm just like even thinking just how hard sometimes and complicated a title of a car can be. So, like,
exactly.
Right.
Comparing it to a plot of land that has been owned by someone perhaps thousands of years ago is sort of wild.
I mean, there's so many layers, Dave, because even the concept of ownership and title is an imported concept. So it's not an Indigenous concept. And in California, we've had 4 waves of genocide, and all of those waves have involved displacement. So if you have, going back generations, displacement, people taken to different missions, sometimes in the same tribe, sometimes in different tribes, it makes it more complicated. So I think every geographical area in the country has its own particular challenges. Would this be a good time to talk about the website that Joe was mentioning?
Yeah, I think this is the perfect time. I think where would you even start?
So this is not my website. It is a website out of Canada called native-land.ca. And if you go to it, it's actually an interactive map of the world. And there's a huge disclaimer, you can't go to it, that says, these are not official boundaries. Please contact the nations in question. But once you accept the disclaimer, you could type your address, Dave, in there and see what names pop up. And what will probably happen is there will be 2 or more names of tribal groups, either specific tribes or tribal groups or categories of tribal groups. And so an example would be, my office is in Redwood City, California. And if you go to Native Land and type in our address, you come up with 2 particular tribal groups that are nonprofits of unrecognized tribes. And then Ohlone, which is the name for the category of which those 2 groups are part of. But if you look at the category at another source in the California State Commission, Native American Heritage Commission, they have a digital atlas of Native American tribes and tribal groups. You'll get 11 Ohlone groups. So what I recommend is at least there's a starting place, and there's many other starting places. I was in Minneapolis doing a presentation for for our firm on this topic last week. And so I did the same thing with the Minneapolis office, and I came up with these 2 tribal groups, but then I did a Google search and it came up with a completely different tribal group. And so the next question then is, okay, well, in California, I know a bit about the local groups in the Bay Area because I've been doing this and I've been thinking about it and, doing these searches. But in Minneapolis, I have no idea. So then my next question would be, who can I ask there?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also trying to figure out who's doing this work in these places, and it's emerging. So there may or may not be people you can find. There's some community foundations who are doing work because if there are tribal nonprofits that are doing work in a particular geographical area, community foundations may or may not be connected. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, I know that San Francisco Foundation, Silicon Valley Foundation, East Bay Community Foundation, Marin Community Foundation, they have at least some awareness of some of the tribal nonprofit groups that are in their geographical area. Because it's emerging, Dave, I think that it really is going to depend on the area. Part of what I'm trying to do is I actually have a study group of practitioners that meets every 1 to 3 months. And the reason is, when I started getting into this work, I was trying to find out who's doing this. But there weren't enough people doing it. So I was actually just also trying to build people's understanding as I'm learning in terms of how to think about doing land back work in different places.
Interesting. Yeah, it definitely seems like one of those things where you kind of can't be afraid to be foolish or to look foolish. I know, when you were talking about, starting relationships with the tribes that you may be giving back to, like, to me, as just like a basic, like, goofy, guilty white liberal, it's like, that's like, I would be worried, am I going to be treated poorly because I'm coming to them with, like, hey, I'm going to give you back this land we stole from you. Aren't I great? Like, it seems like it might be, I would almost be concerned that I would be looked at as, like, I look down upon in a way, even though I was trying to do something, but obviously I think that would be, that's my own pathology, I have to imagine.
You're wrong, Dave. I think that's a thing that any group that's like, if there's any oppressed group, any other people outside of that group, which would be non-Indigenous people such as myself, potentially you, we get worried about saying the wrong thing. And the way it started with me is I knew about the Segorite Land Trust, which is that East Bay organization. It had been coming up in all these different circles with people I knew. So I just called them. I called their development director and I said, I'm trying to figure out land return and land back in my law practice, estates and trust law practice. Do you have people that you're talking to? Like, is there people that have been working with you on it that would be good for me to talk to? Because it's going to come up with my clients. So that's a really good lead in for those of us who are professional advisors, who are, like the audience for this podcast, for instance. And that was an interesting, so that started the conversation. So I got a call from somebody who was on staff of that land trust organization, who happens to themselves not be Indigenous, but also has been doing development with this organization. And so we had a good conversation about who's doing it, what the need is in estate planning, what some of the particular challenges are, which is exactly actually the conversation I was hoping to have. I didn't know where it would go, but I engaged with that person. And then I got to the point where I said, well, if I have a house in San Francisco, do you want it? Is like, would I leave it to you? And he said, actually, you would leave it to the Ramaytush Ohlone, because we're an East Bay based Indigenous group. And that's when it started cluing into me, oh, this is place-based.
Yeah.
So then I just looked them up online. Ramaytush Ohlone have an organization called the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone. There's 2 staff people. I reached out to them and I basically did the same thing that I did to the first group, which is I said, hey, I'm an estate and trust lawyer. It's coming up in my practice. Do you accept land returns? And who is working with you around land returns that would be good for me to network with? And they were actually delighted to hear from me. So you never know. But the thing I want to caution is that this is something that Joe reminded me of recently, which is a lot of these nonprofit Indigenous orgs, at least in California, in the Bay Area, a lot of them are kind of smaller and newer. And if they're not affiliated with a federally recognized tribe, they don't have very many resources. So they're stretched. So they may not have that much time to talk to all of your clients, for instance. And also there's this funny way where if you're not in the group, you sometimes expect them to teach you about how to think about them, which you shouldn't expect them to do for free. Like if you're going to be taking up people's time, like offer to compensate them for their time or figure out who the other people are that could help teach.
Like you would bring in any other sort of expert professional in
Yes.
a different field that you didn't understand.
And
Exactly.
I would say that using different words, which is, I think it's important to be patient. And to, when contacting people in Indigenous groups, allow them to respond in the way and according to the timetable that works for them. Also, don't take credit for the work that they're doing. This has been going on for hundreds of years already, where Indigenous people don't get credit for what they do. It's really important to give credit where credit is due. And this is important in the law review literature too. I've been reviewing several works on land trusts, and almost to the last one, in fact, to the last one, the conclusion is, aren't the land trusts great for giving the land back to Indigenous people? I see it very differently, which is Indigenous people are here through their intergenerational efforts. And it's not really just the land trusts who have recently come to help. To me, that's a repetition. It's like an echo from the 19th century. Here come this group, here comes that group, here comes the other group to help.
It's the savior
It's the savior complex, yeah. And I think also to, like in the work that I do, I am working with the chair of the Ramaytush Ohlone. We want to set up a think tank to talk about what are the legal issues, to sort of talk with people in the state and other tribal leaders and scholars. What are the legal issues that unrecognized tribes in California face? And the reason this is of concern to everyone is, and this is my last point about what I would like people to really at least ponder, because I'm not sure we can but ponder it. In California, because there was a genocide, the population of Indigenous people was very negatively impacted. And people don't just bounce back from that. It's been 150 years. The population, one historian has done work to show that the population levels have returned to what they were in 1849. But there's a lot of ongoing trauma and sort of inherited trauma that people are dealing with. And so be respectful of that. It's a real thing.
Interesting. So I didn't expect us necessarily to get here, honestly, when I came into this topic, but it seems like every episode of this show, no matter what our overarching topic is, it ultimately comes down to communication and respect.
Yeah.
And it seems at the beginning, I believe it was Alma suggested, forming a relationship with these tribes. It seems like that's kind of non-negotiable from what I'm hearing, just from what you guys are saying, to even find out who you would go about trying to give the land back to. You're already having to put yourself out there and sort of create some sort of relationship with a small organization. And I think that's, I guess, somehow, and this one is also the moral of the story, is that sort of communication and respect go a long way in sort of greasing the wheels and making these things work for everyone involved.
I think they do, and I think ultimately they go in the direction of healing for everybody, and that's a good place to go, in my view.
That's about all the time we have for today. I'd love to thank Professor Joe Carillo and Alma Soongi Beck for coming on and putting up with my stumbling, ignorant questions, and also just helping us try to pack into about 50 minutes a really enormous topic that I'm sure that their knowledge is vast and they have so much more they want to tell us, but we sort of have to compact things for our audience. So thank you guys so much for coming on and for teaching us about this super interesting topic.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
And for all our listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Informa WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.